Hello ATS 315 students, Dr. Shragi here, and before we get started with the other part of the main part of this lecture here, one of the things I want to do in each of these little discussion lectures is kind of steer us towards some thoughts about operating systems in our day-to-day lives. You know, I think we all know about Windows that's running on most of the PCs and laptops and all that kind of stuff out there, and I think we all know about things like Mac OS that would run on a MacBook or whatever, and of course things like iOS on an iPhone or Android on a smartphone. But there's other kinds of computers out there, and you'll be surprised how often what they're running is just a variation of Unix. And for what I wanted to do today, I thought I'd show you my TV here at home in the basement is running. We don't even have cable or anything like that. I just have a Roku box. I guess you guys know way more about these kind of devices than I do. We've actually had this particular Roku box, I don't know, maybe 5 years already. And it's just a little computer. This is a little computer here running inside this box. The cords are short, so I can't hold it up and show it to you. But you know, it's just a little box. And you guys know about these things, right? I mean, it could have been Amazon Fire TV. It could have been Chromecast by Google. It could have been Apple TV. Anyway, there's any number of these kinds of things out there. And it's a little computer that has a little interface that we can use the remote on, and it can run applications or apps. And in this case, I'm loading the Netflix app. And in this little case here, I can, as soon as it gets done loading, I can, you know, flip through different videos we could be watching or whatever. Here's the deal. Roku is this little box here that we bought for like $40 is a computer. It has computer chips, it has computer memory, it's doing stuff right now. It is managing files, it is communicating on the network, it's decrypting data, it's handling an interface, it's outputting to a screen, and you know what? It's running an operating system, and that operating system is called Roku OS. Roku OS is the operating system that Roku's run on, and I bet you won't believe what it is. It's Linux. All the engineers at Roku did is download a copy of Linux, and they've made changes to it to run on this little computer here. And let's make no mistake, this is a little computer. I mean, this little thing right in here has a tiny little chip with very little power, can't really do all that many calculations per second, it doesn't have all that much memory. They hacked Linux to run on this thing, and okay, this doesn't look very much like Linux on Chesapeake, right? I mean, we're not sitting here typing CP and LS and using VI, but you know what? We could. If we could hack into this box, and yes, hacks like that exist, there are ways to actually get to a prompt on here and work with the command line interface. You know what's going to be on here? VI and GCC and all the things that we've been using so far this semester. It's a Linux computer, and it's a very cheap little Linux computer, but just goes to show how powerful computers running Unix and Linux can be. I mean, this tiny little thing, I'm sure Roku didn't pay $1 for that chipset that's in there. I mean, it's a very, very inexpensive little chip in contrast to the processor that's in your MacBook or whatever, is running all of this. Now, they had to do a lot of programming to make all this fancy interface stuff and so on, but it's just programming running on a Linux computer. Okay? Why is Roku OS type of Linux? Because they could get it to run on practically anything, like this tiny little computer that they bought for practically nothing, and it's free, and it already exists. They didn't have to pay anybody for Linux. It's free, anybody can download it, and anybody can make whatever changes they want to and call it whatever they want. They can give it away or they can charge for it. In this case, they are charging for it. I paid money for Roku OS. It was part of what I paid for when I bought my Roku box. They wouldn't have had to do any of that. They could have, the software engineers at Roku could have sat down and started with a blank program and just started writing and wrote their own Roku operating system, but it would have taken forever. And all it would have been doing is duplicating effort. Somebody already wrote Linux, how to manage files, how to work with screens of different resolution, how to communicate with the internet, how to encrypt and decrypt data streams that are coming in, how to do all the things, all the management of the memory, all of the working with files. All that stuff already existed. There was no reason for the engineers at Roku to redo all of that. And the same is true. Google Chromecast is just running a type of Linux. Fire TV is running a type of Android, which itself is a type of Linux. And Apple TVs, they're running a version of iOS, which itself is a type of Unix. It doesn't come from the same family as Linux, but it's a part of the Unix family. Why? Because they didn't have to reinvent the wheel. Those engineers were able to get a product like this to us cheaply and easily and quickly by just adapting Linux to the job. If you've got one of these things in your life, you've got a Linux computer. Just like as if you have an Android phone in your pocket, you have a Linux computer in your pocket. These things are cheap and easy. They're a commodity now. At my wife's dental practice, she has them in all the operatories, and the patients can be watching whatever they want to watch while she's, getting ready, while they're getting numb before she drills on them. I mean, we just bought her, a basket full of these things for her office building. Linux is everywhere. All right, in just a second, we'll start the second part of this lecture. Okay, we're back, and I decided to go outside today and record the lecture because it's just a lovely day. I apologize if you can hear the neighbors mowing or something like that in the back, but it's just such a pretty day. I wanted to point you to a couple of things specifically that were in the reading by Stephenson. He had all this text here about, it kind of reminds us just how far back this book was written, but that's okay. It's important to understand the context here. He's talking about the ways in which people feel about different operating systems, and he talks about, he gives a kind of an uncharitable thing at first. He says, he's talking about why is Microsoft Windows unreliable, because I mean it's true, certainly if you go back to like 1998 rather, or whatever, when he wrote this book, Windows was a fairly crash-prone operating system, certainly more so than like Mac OS or something. And he wrote, it's because Microsoft's excellent management has figured out that they can make more money for their stockholders by releasing stuff with obvious known imperfections than they can by making it beautiful or bug-free. That strikes me as being kind of uncharitable. He's basically saying that they're deliberately releasing things that have bugs and so on. I don't know that I would say that's true. But I think that's true that Microsoft certainly had no incentive back then when they controlled 99% of the PCs out there. PC meaning like literally like as in personal computers. That could be a Mac, that could be a Toshiba, that could be an IBM, whatever. Certainly when they controlled such a very large chunk of the total market, there really wasn't much incentive for them to do things differently or to spend the time and energy to make it perfect or whatever. They controlled so much it didn't really matter. Perhaps more interesting, again, thinking about the context about it, he says, in the end, that's only half so annoying as watching Apple inscrutably and relentlessly destroy itself. Again, keep in mind that he's thinking about this before the rise of Mac OS X and the return of Steve Jobs. Certainly in the mid to late 90s, Apple was basically out of business. They're trying to sell, $3,000, $4,000, $5,000 computers to the personal computer market at a time when cars cost like $7,000. There just wasn't any reason to buy a Mac at that point in time. They were less powerful and more expensive than any alternative. And to somebody who had been a big fan of Macs, the way Neil Stephenson had been in the 80s and early 90s, it seemed a mystery. Why did the company allow this to happen? But the author took some time to think about why do people actually hate Microsoft products? Again, thinking about this in the context of the time when these were very ugly choices being made, he said hostility towards Microsoft is not difficult to find on the net, and it blends two strains. People who are resentful to Microsoft because it's too powerful, and disdainful because they think it's tacky. We can talk about each of those points in just a little bit, but I mean, I think it's worth reflecting for a moment. Do you know people who hate Microsoft Windows? And do you know, maybe you feel that way for that matter, and why do they feel the way they do? There's certainly a lot of people who still have a lot of reasons of saying Microsoft products are ugly, or they think that they are hard to use, or that they are full of viruses or something. But of course, computers in this day and age are very comparable. I mean, Mac has approximately the same amount of problems with viruses and so on as like a Windows computer does or whatever. The point about it being tacky certainly does go back to the dark days of Windows when things were definitely less aesthetically pleasing. The author is referring in there to the Microsoft Word 6 splash screen, which I reproduced for you here, and how not only is it ugly, I mean, who drew this? This is weird. But I mean, it just confuses the whole idea of what a word processor is for. I mean, we got this beautiful fountain pen there. Well, wait a minute. People who use word processors are not really fountain pen people, right? Fountain pen people are like pen collectors or people who sign legislation, or, like the governor's office might use fountain pens. This is not... Who is this appealing to, right? I mean, They could have drawn something lovely, they could have drawn something ugly. Why did they go with something ugly? It's a peculiar design choice. And it's a choice they frankly didn't make much better at different times in the history. Here's Word 95. I wrote my PhD thesis in Word 95, and I can tell you many times I looked at that logo and was like, what were they even thinking? I mean, good grief, a fountain pen and puzzle pieces, and I don't even know what all some of that stuff's supposed to be. It's confusing. Definitely, if that logo doesn't have so much about puzzle pieces, some other ones do. Hey, it's starting to rain. I'll move inside. Okay, in the end, actually, that was just a tiny little passing shower, just a little thunder shower that was passing through. It's only been about 2 minutes and the rain has already stopped. Anyway, so, you know, again, just to show you another example of a Windows design choice that you've got to be wondering, what in the world were they doing? Here's Windows, what is this, Word Mac 2008. What on earth is even going on here? I mean, what, again, if you were typing something up in Word, what's with the weird font? What's with the weird perspective? Again, this couldn't have even been checked by anybody in graphics design. I mean, it was just odd. Microsoft has basically a monopoly on Office software. What's the why would they spend money, you know, making it visually appealing? Well, that's a good point. And actually, if you go dig deeper into the operating system, there's lots of weird choices, especially in older versions of Windows. Famously, the control panel had some weird things. Let me just give you a quote from the textbook about it. Recently, I spent some while reinstalling Windows NT on one of my home computers, and many times had to double-click on the control panel icon. And for reasons that are difficult to fathom, this icon consists of a picture of a claw hammer and a chisel and a screwdriver on top of a file folder. Yeah, what does that even mean? Why? How? I mean, when you think about what the control panel for a operating system would be, things like controlling the resolution of the monitor and stuff. Why a hammer, a tool? Why a hammer, a screwdriver, and chisel? I mean, of all the tools you should be using to make settings on your computer, a claw hammer and screwdriver and a chisel are the last choice. Somebody actually got paid to make that icon. What were they thinking? And you know, it wasn't just the operating system. I mean, the hardware was ugly too. Just and frankly continues to be in many ways. I mean, even the hardware that Windows ran on, when compared to the machines put out by Apple, looked like white trash stuff, and still mostly does. The free market seems to have decided that people are not willing to pay for cool-looking computers. PC makers who hire designers to make their stuff look distinctive get their clocks cleaned by Taiwanese clone makers, punching out boxes that look as if they belong on cinder blocks in front of someone's trailer. Man, I love Neil Stephenson. He just writes the coolest stuff. But, okay, this certainly was true back 20 years ago or 15 years ago when he was writing this. I mean, if I just sort of flipped here through some I just did a Google image search on like computers from the 90s or something. I mean, look at that beige box over there to the left. I mean, that is just an ugly, I mean, no designer spent any time making that thing look good or whatever. I mean, even that Alienware PC that's sitting there next to there is more ugly than clever. Again, just looking at some other examples of some, these are some Packard Bell computers from the mid-90s, and oh my gosh. I mean, the different colors of plastic don't even match. I mean, you can see about how much effort the manufacturers were going to. Why? Because they found that that didn't sell. Now, today, you know, yeah, by and large, especially laptops, the manufacturers have found that people are willing to pay, at least sometimes are willing to pay for premium materials like aluminum or magnesium, and sometimes are willing to pay for like even higher grades of plastic and stuff for the covers, although frankly the cheap computers still sell a lot, and there's an awful lot of laptops out there that look more or less like this ugly laptop. I've got a picture right here too. I mean, the truth is, the cheap ones sell. Not that many people are that worried about what their computer looks like. In contrast, let me just show you some old family pictures of from the Apple line. I mean, that's a MacBook. I'm sorry, that's a Mac Cube over there on the left, and what an unusual and interesting looking computer. It had all kinds of design problems. It tended to overheat and so on. But it was a good design choice. Even that older machine sitting next to it, it's not so bad. A whole family of Blueberry computers and stuff like that that Mac released in like the late 90s and so on. I mean, you can decide whether you like them or not, but at least designers were involved in it. Somebody spent money to make something somebody wanted to buy. Okay, I personally think most of them were pretty ugly too, but I'm willing to acknowledge that somebody spent money on it. And you know, again, these ones I'm showing you here, that's an iMac. It's an iMac. It's an older iMac on the left and a Mac, one of the Power Mac or whatever on the right. I mean, you can again feel whether those are your style of computers or not, but you gotta admit, at least somebody spent some time thinking about what this thing should look like. Well, I mean, it's a product. Somebody spent time trying to figure out if this is something you want. In contrast to those cheap clone computers like those Packard Bells that all they spent time on is making it as cheaply as possible because they thought that's what you want. You just want to spend as little money as possible because it's just going to be sitting under your desk or whatever. What does it matter what it looks like? Now, no matter what kind of computer you have or computing device you have, and whether it's going to be running an operating system, whether we're talking Windows or Mac OS X or Android or iOS or Chrome OS or whatever. In the case of Chesapeake, it's running Linux, okay? In the case of my Roku box that I showed you at the beginning of this video, it's running Roku OS. Creating operating systems is an enormous amount of work. They are we think of operating systems in terms of like the interface. Oh, I like how Mac does this, or I like how Windows does this, but it's really all the heavy lifting of what's going on underneath. The operating system is controlling how the memory works, how it interfaces with the network, how it interfaces with devices that you plug in on USB ports. It's controlling how the disk drive is operating, etc. That's all a lot of work, and it's kind of all duplication. I mean, all that stuff's been written once before. The actual code, the programs that some programmer at Microsoft wrote, might be a trade secret. The actual code that somebody wrote when making their version of Linux might be open. You can download it and so on. But no matter what the code does is not really a secret. I mean, Microsoft owns the copyright on their code that controls how Windows interfaces with a network connection. No one has ever seen that code except for software engineers at Microsoft who have signed confidentiality pledges and things like that so that they would not non-disclose agreements and things like that. But it's no secret how it works. I mean, I don't know how it works. You don't know how it works. But some other programmer does. Okay, they know how it works. It's got to be able to communicate this way on this port and return channel on this channel and all that kind of stuff. How it works is not really a secret. And another programmer would do it differently, maybe better. But see, that's the problem. Because in the end, how do you charge for that? How does Microsoft charge for Windows, which does things like run the network, or run its video graphics card, or control its memory, or control the hard drive, or receive interface from the mouse, when all of that stuff is really something somebody else can do better? Or differently? Or charge less for? Or charge nothing for? I mean, it kind of becomes, how do you convince somebody to spend money on Windows when somebody else can just write the same stuff? They can't see your code, but if you're a programmer, it's not a secret how any of that stuff works. Well, there's a couple of options. You could choose to compete based on the features that you make available in Windows or Mac OS or Android or whatever, or you can choose to compete by telling people that yours is better. Better. We'll have to decide what that means. Well, you can choose to add features, but the truth is that an operating system is not that complicated of it. I mean, it's a complicated thing, but I mean, we've had them working since like the 70s. So you just add things to the operating system. It's hard to imagine these days, but you know, there was a day when browsers didn't come with the operating system. You had to download the browser aftermarket, and you could choose a different browser. I mean, nowadays, of course, you can choose a different browser too. You can download Firefox or Chrome or whatever you want, but every computer comes out of the box with a browser installed as part of the operating system. Why? Because it was a feature. Originally, Windows didn't have a browser, then it started shipping with the browser. It was something new they could advertise, they could sell it by. Voice recognition software, antivirus features, built-in media players, things like that. None of that has anything to do with the operating system, but it's something you can sell. You can sell your Mac OS because it has these things. You can sell your Windows because it has these things, and so on. And actually, there's a tremendous amount of other stuff. For example, Windows computers didn't, if you go back 15, 20 years, they didn't ship knowing how to work with the internet. You had to download a separate piece of software like Windsock Trumpet that knew how to work with the internet. Can you imagine that actually existed back then? You bought a disk that contained the software, and you put the disk in your machine, and it installed Windsock Trumpet that was how to make that network card communicate on those wires to the internet. Oh my gosh. Well, of course, at some point, communicating with the network became a standard thing that's just available on Windows computers and Macs and everything else. Another possibility is to decide to convince the market that what you're doing is better than what they can get for free. For example,
you want to convince the IT department at a place of business that your product will always be supported. Okay? There's nothing scarier to something like Do It or other IT departments out there than to say, ah gosh, what's going to happen if these guys go out of business or they stop supporting a product or whatever? Yeah, that's right. So something like Microsoft will say, look, we're always going to be here. Choose our stuff because we'll always be here if you guys need help. We'll always be offering training classes that you can send your people to. Well, that is a feature. Okay, I understand why IT departments choose Microsoft products based on things like that. They know there'll always be support. Another one is to convince companies that your software is more secure or gets faster updates when there's a problem or whatever, making your operating system a better choice. Famously, in the history of computer science, there's an expression, nobody ever got fired for buying IBM. Okay? IBM was the default choice. Companies that needed mainframes bought IBM mainframes. They needed desktop workstations for the staff. They bought IBM. Why? Because it was always going to be there. You knew that if you needed support from IBM, they would be available. There'd be books available. There'd be training classes to go to. If something was wrong with the mainframe, there would always be somebody at IBM to answer the questions. And that was a good choice. That was how business made its choices. And we still kind of do make choices that way. Do you know why Creighton runs an Exchange mail server that's a Microsoft product that's like Outlook and so on? For exactly the same reason. They hypothetically evaluated lots of other ways Creighton could have gotten its email. But ultimately, the folks that do it decided they know Microsoft will always be there. They can always send somebody to a class to learn how to run a Microsoft Exchange server. They will always be able to get books on how to run this stuff. Some of the other choices might have been better. Some of the other choices might have been cheaper. It certainly couldn't be more expensive. Microsoft Exchange is wildly expensive. But it was a safe choice. They knew they'd always have support. The question is that still a good way to make choices, especially when it comes to like operating system? I mean, is it always the best idea to buy a Windows computer these days? Are there places where maybe buying a Mac is not such a good idea? I mean, you're paying an awful big premium to have Windows on there. You're paying an awfully big premium to have that be a Macintosh computer. You know, maybe that's still not a great choice. Maybe that idea that it's always worth paying money to get the company behind this stuff no longer works. And Stephenson addresses this with what is in many ways the most shocking thing that he says in this book, which he says, it is the fate of operating systems to become free. That's going to be one of the things you're going to be doing in discussion 3, is you're going to be talking about why it's the fate of operating systems to be free. But let me just kind of get you on a track. I mean, you've already read this reading from the book, but let me steer you towards part of what he says in the book here. He says, he's saying, even when he was writing this, Windows 95 or Windows 98, for example, was the standard Microsoft operating system. You couldn't even buy DOS anymore, and you certainly can't buy DOS now. You cannot go to Best Buy and ask somebody to buy a copy of DOS. Even if DOS did what you needed your computer to do, if you go to Best Buy and ask somebody to buy, you want to buy a box that has the discs in there for DOS, they're going to look at you like you're crazy. Why? Not only could Gates and Allen, the heads of Microsoft at that time, not sell MS-DOS today, they couldn't even give it away because even much more powerful operating systems are already being given away. Even the original Windows, which was the only Windows until 1995, has become worthless. There is no point in owning something that can be emulated inside of Linux for free. In other words, to some extent, this is something that the operating system companies like Windows, like Microsoft, are fighting against, right? I mean, how do you sell something that other people are giving better away free, like Linux and so on? So, I mean, that's a good question to ask yourself. Does it make sense to buy things when free is available and free is better? When the free things are better? I would certainly say Linux is better than Windows, and I don't have to pay anything for Linux. I mean, to get Chesapeake, I had to buy a Windows 7 computer and take Windows 7 off. I paid for a copy of Windows 7 that I erased, okay? I wouldn't have had to do that. I could have gone out and bought the parts and built Chesapeake, but I didn't. It's too difficult to do that at Creighton, actually. They don't like you doing that. Does it make sense to sell things anymore, like operating systems, if other companies are going to be giving it away for free. And this is something Google really figured out well with Android. This is a development, of course, since Stephenson wrote this book. Google figured this out. Google could very well have made Android a product. They could have charged for it. They could have either charged you when you bought your Android phone to put Android on it, or they could have charged the original equipment manufacturers, the OEMs like HTC and Samsung and so on. They could have charged those companies for it, but they don't. And it's a weird choice that they didn't. I mean, people would have paid for it. But somebody else would have written a new operating system that could do everything Android done, because what Android does isn't a secret. It's managing memory, it's managing communication to cell phone towers, it's managing connections to a Wi-Fi. All that's complicated, but it's not a secret, and programmers can make their own versions of that stuff. And that person who wrote an alternative to Android could have done whatever they want. They could have given it away, they could have charged for it, they could have made it better than Android, and Google would have had no control over all that. Instead, Google gives Android away. If you are a manufacturer of cell phones, they will give you the copy away. You can download Android, and if you want to try to hack it and get it to work on your microwave oven, well, you aren't going to get it on a microwave oven, but on any little electronic device you want to, go for it. There's no one's going to stop you from doing that. Sure, and Google really doesn't have any control of that. In practice, the manufacturers can make whatever changes they want to Android, but in practice, it wouldn't be easy. Mostly the manufacturers just make superficial changes. They put different widgets on and different icons on and stuff like that. And under the covers, it's still 100% Android, which explains why so many different kinds of handsets, HTC and Samsung and all kinds of weird Chinese brands and so on, why they all run Android. Because Google gives it away. Google doesn't make its money by selling Android. It makes its money by getting you into the Google ecosystem, where you're using all of Google's services like Google Search and Google Maps and Google Gmail and so on, where ads are producing revenue. Apple took a very different approach. Apple sells devices. Apple sells iPhones. They sell iPads. And they are a hardware company, and they work very hard to make sure that the operating system, which people love, like iOS, won't run anywhere else. I mean, if you could install iOS on a Samsung tablet, most people would choose the Samsung tablet, right? But Apple doesn't want that, because Apple wants you, they don't want to sell you just the operating system, they want to sell you the device. There's a huge markup on that. So Apple's in the business of selling you hardware. You might love iOS, or you might love the Apple ecosystem like iTunes and things like that. Apple doesn't particularly care. They just want to get you into the fold where you are buying their hardware. That's something we're thinking about. How did you decide what computer or operating system or whatever you bought? Or phone, or tablet, or smart TV, or whatever. How did you decide? And was it a really rational decision, or were you just buying what people you knew bought, or what you used to own before? However you made that decision, is that really the way businesses or schools or somebody should be making those choices? Is it the way they do make those choices? You know, a grade school will still have a computer lab, or will issue laptops to students. How do they decide what kind of computers to use? I mean, you know, this is kind of a famous picture of this classroom where everybody's got a Mac there, or whatever. But that would be in many ways a disastrous choice. I mean, all those computers are very expensive, and better alternatives exist, and cheaper alternatives exist. You know, many grade schools, for example, nowadays use Chrome OS because it's cheaper, and it's a type of Linux, so it's more secure, and it's more easily updated, and all that kind of good stuff. How do they make those decisions? Well, I invite you to kind of keep that in your mind over the course of the semester as to how do people decide what they're going to buy? How do they decide what's going to be the right tool for the job? Because someday you're going to be out in the professional world, and you're going to be part of making decisions about, like, where are we going to be running the WARF model, or what, it won't be called WARF anymore, right? It'll be something new. And so you need to know, how do we make decisions about computers? How do we make decisions about what we're going to be doing? And how do we know if we've got the right decision? All right, that's a whole lot to think about. The third unit of the third module of the course is really quite exciting. I'm looking forward to seeing what you guys come up with, and we're heading towards graphics. We're not quite there yet, but you're going to start making graphics programs in just a couple weeks. So let me know if you have any questions. This has been Dr. John Schrage.